The airplane cabin hummed with the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats, the overhead bins clicking shut one by one. It was a routine flight, or so everyone thought. A mix of business travelers, vacationers, and families filled the rows, each person preoccupied with their own thoughts. Among them was a woman who caught more than a few glances as she boarded. Dressed in a sleek black pantsuit, she walked with a quiet confidence, her curly hair framing a face that seemed calm, yet determined. Her name was Rachel, and she carried herself like someone who had seen both the best and worst the world had to offer. Rachel took her seat near the window, her movements deliberate but unassuming. Beside her sat an older gentleman who smiled politely, though the unease in his posture hinted he wasn't much of a conversationalist. Across the aisle, a mother struggled to calm her fussy toddler while juggling snacks and a brightly colored tablet. It was an ordinary flight for most, but not for Rachel. She had her reasons for being here, though no one could have guessed the storm brewing just below her composed exterior. Minutes after the last passengers boarded, a distinct commotion began near the front of the plane. Heads turned as a uniformed police officer entered the cabin, his face stern and his eyes scanning the rows. The murmurs grew louder, whispers of "what's going on?" and "is something wrong?" rippled through the cabin like wildfire. Rachel didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, her hands resting on her lap, as though she had anticipated this moment. The officer stopped abruptly near Rachel's row, his presence casting a shadow over the passengers seated nearby. His eyes locked onto her, and the tension in the air thickened. "Ma'am," he said, his tone cold and commanding, "I need you to come with me." A wave of disbelief swept through the plane. Passengers exchanged incredulous looks, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Rachel turned her head slowly, meeting the officer's gaze without a hint of fear. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as though she had been expecting this confrontation all along. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice measured and steady. "Step out of your seat," the officer repeated, his voice louder this time. The eyes of nearly every passenger were now trained on Rachel, their curiosity mingled with unease. The mother across the aisle hugged her child closer, while the older gentleman beside Rachel shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Rachel sighed softly, then stood up with the kind of grace that made the moment feel almost surreal. As she rose, the officer reached for her arm, but she raised a hand to stop him. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice firm but composed. "Let's not make this difficult," the officer said, clearly frustrated by her calm demeanor. But Rachel's lack of resistance seemed to unnerve him even more. She stepped into the aisle, her head held high, her presence commanding attention in a way that words alone couldn't. The whispers around them grew louder. "What did she do?" one man asked. "Why is she being arrested?" Another voice chimed in, but no one had answers, only assumptions. Some passengers looked at Rachel with suspicion, while others seemed uneasy with how the situation was unfolding. Still, Rachel remained silent, allowing the officer to escort her toward the front of the plane. Just as they reached the exit row, the officer paused, glancing at the flight attendant who had been watching with wide, uncertain eyes. "This passenger is being detained for questioning," he explained, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The announcement sent another ripple of shock through the crowd. Rachel turned to face the passengers, her calm demeanor unchanged despite the countless cameras now pointed in her direction. She scanned the faces staring back at her, some filled with judgment, others with confusion. And then, just as the officer moved to lead her off the plane, she said something that made everyone freeze. Her words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced the entire cabin. The murmurs stopped, the phones recording her trembling slightly in the hands of their owners. The officer, caught off guard, faltered mid-step, his grip on her arm loosening ever so slightly. The sentence hung in the air like an electric charge, its impact rippling through every corner of the plane. No one could have predicted what Rachel would say, or the chain of events it would set into motion. Rachel's words echoed in the silent cabin, their weight pressing on everyone who heard them. For a moment, no one moved. The officer blinked, his grip faltering as if he wasn't sure he had heard her correctly. The passengers, frozen in their seats, stared at her with a mix of confusion and curiosity, their earlier murmurs now replaced by an eerie stillness. The flight attendant standing nearby cleared her throat nervously. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice shaky, her eyes darting between Rachel and the officer. Rachel didn't answer. She stood still, her head held high, her face unreadable. It wasn't fear that kept her silent. Anyone could see that. No, Rachel was calculating waiting, as if the next move wasn't hers to make but someone else's. The officer, clearly thrown off by her composure, tightened his jaw. "Let's go," he said again, his voice firmer, though it lacked the confidence it had just moments ago. Rachel didn't resist. She turned toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she walked. The passengers leaned into the aisles, their eyes following her every move. Whispers began again, hushed but insistent, each person eager to understand what they'd just witnessed. "What do you think she said? Is she someone famous? She looks so calm for someone being arrested." "Maybe it's a misunderstanding," one voice suggested, though their tone didn't sound convinced. The officer walked close behind Rachel, his movements more mechanical now, as if the confidence he had when entering the plane had been left behind somewhere in row 12. The flight attendant stepped aside, clutching her clipboard tightly, her expression a mix of concern and unease. As Rachel approached the cabin door, she suddenly stopped. Her stillness was startling. The officer nearly bumped into her, caught off guard by her abrupt pause. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back at the passengers, her gaze steady and deliberate. It was the kind of look that made people question everything they thought they knew. And then, just like that, she spoke again. "Remember this moment," she said, her voice calm but somehow commanding, as though she was addressing not just the passengers but the world beyond them. "Because the truth always comes out." With that, she stepped forward, leaving the stunned crowd behind as the officer guided her off the plane. The cabin door closed with a soft thud, and the hum of the engines filled the uneasy silence. For a moment, no one said a word. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. "What did she mean by that? Do you think she's innocent? Why didn't she fight back? She just went with him." The mother across the aisle clutched her toddler a little tighter, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the now empty seat Rachel had occupied. "Something's not right," she murmured, almost to herself. She didn't seem guilty at all. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot exchanged uncertain glances. The commotion had delayed their takeoff, and the tension in the air was palpable even behind the closed door. "Do we have clearance to depart?" the co-pilot asked, his voice low. The captain nodded but hesitated. "Yeah, but..." He trailed off, glancing at the radio. "Something about this doesn't sit right. Did you see her? She didn't look like someone who'd done anything wrong." The co-pilot shrugged, his hands adjusting the controls. "Maybe, but that's not for us to decide. We're just here to fly the plane." Back in the terminal, Rachel walked calmly alongside the officer, her hands uncuffed, her posture as straight as ever. She didn't speak, and the officer didn't either, though his eyes occasionally darted toward her, as if expecting her to suddenly bolt or cause a scene. But Rachel did neither. She moved with the kind of quiet assurance
As they
that made
reached
it
the
impossible
security
to look
office,
away. The officer opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Rachel stepped inside without hesitation. The room was small, sterile, the walls lined with security monitors and a desk cluttered with papers. A second officer, this one older with a graying beard, looked up from his chair, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Is this her?" he asked, his voice gruff. The younger officer nodded. "Yeah, pulled her off the flight. Got a call from higher-ups, said she was a person of interest." The older officer's eyes narrowed as he studied Rachel. "She doesn't look like much trouble to me," he muttered, though his tone carried an edge of suspicion. "What's the story?" Rachel finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "Why don't you tell me?" she said, her words sharp but not loud. "You've clearly been given orders, so what am I accused of?" The older officer frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You're not under arrest," he said carefully, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure of the truth. We just need to ask you a few questions. Rachel tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. Questions about what? The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his confidence from earlier now completely gone. Look, he said, his voice quieter than before. We're just following protocol. Someone flagged your name. That's all we know. Rachel let out a soft, humorless laugh. Flagged my name, she repeated. Do you even know who flagged it, or why? The officers exchanged a glance but didn't answer. Rachel sighed and folded her arms across her chest. Of course you don't, she said, her tone laced with both frustration and something else, something deeper, almost like pity. You're just doing what you're told. The room fell silent again, the hum of the security monitors the only sound. The older officer cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Look, Miss Bennett. Dr. Bennett, Rachel corrected, her voice firm. If you're going to detain me, at least use my correct title. The older officer hesitated, then nodded. Dr. Bennett, he said, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. We're just trying to figure out what's going on here. If you cooperate, this will go a lot smoother. Rachel's expression didn't change. And if I don't? She asked, her tone calm but unyielding. The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unsure how to handle her. It was clear that Rachel wasn't going to make this easy for them, not because she was being difficult, but because she wasn't afraid. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle them. Outside the room, a small crowd of airport staff had begun to gather near the door, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected drama. Among them was a young woman in a bright yellow vest, her hands clutching a clipboard. She leaned closer to one of her colleagues and whispered, "Do you think she's some kind of criminal? She doesn't look like it." Her colleague shrugged. "I don't know," he said, his tone uncertain. "But whatever's going on, it's big. You don't just pull someone off a plane for nothing." Back inside the room, Rachel leaned against the edge of the desk, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "Let me save you some time," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever you think you know about me, you're wrong. But I'm sure that'll come out soon enough." The older officer frowned. "And what makes you so sure of that?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Rachel met his gaze without flinching. "Because the truth always does," she said simply. And for a moment, even the officers couldn't help but wonder if she was right. The room remained heavy with silence after Rachel's words, the weight of her statement hanging in the air. The older officer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read her mind. There was something about her that didn't sit right, not because she seemed dangerous, but because she didn't seem afraid. People in her situation were supposed to plead, explain, or even protest. But Rachel didn't do any of that. Instead, she watched them with an unsettling calm, like someone who had already figured out the game before it even started. The younger officer shuffled awkwardly, clearing his throat as he broke the silence. "Dr. Bennett, we're not here to accuse you of anything," he said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "We just need to understand why your name came up on our list. It's standard protocol." Rachel tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Protocol," she repeated, the word rolling off her tongue like an accusation. That's what people always say when they don't want to admit they're part of something bigger than they understand. The older officer straightened, his brows furrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his tone defensive. Rachel gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It means I know what this is," she said. "I know why I'm here. But the question is, do you?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of doubt. They didn't have answers, not the kind Rachel was hinting at, and it showed. The older officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Let's cut the games," he said gruffly. "If you know something we don't, now's the time to share it." Rachel leaned back slightly, crossing her arms as she regarded him. "I'm not the one playing games," she said. "You are, or rather, the people who sent you are." Before the officer could respond, the door to the room opened, and a third figure stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a sleek suit that screamed authority, and his presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. The officers stiffened, their postures straightening as they turned to face him. Agent Willis, the older officer said, his voice tinged with a mix of respect and unease. We weren't expecting you. The man, Agent Willis, nodded curtly, his piercing gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Rachel. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before addressing the officers. You can step outside, he said. I'll take it from here. The officers hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave, but a single look from Willis sent them scurrying out the door. Rachel watched them go, her expression unchanging, before turning her attention back to the man now standing in front of her. Dr. Bennett, Willis said, his voice smooth and measured. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Rachel arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a wry smile. Finally, she echoed. That's an interesting choice of words. Willis chuckled softly, though there was no warmth in the sound. You're not an easy person to track down, he said. But I suppose that's by design. Rachel didn't respond, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. There was something about Willis, something that set him apart from the others. He wasn't just another cog in the machine. He was part of whatever had brought her here, and he knew more than he was letting on. I'm curious, Willis continued, his tone almost conversational. Do you know why you're here? Rachel hesitated, just long enough to make it clear she was choosing her words carefully. I have my suspicions, she said, but I'm more interested in hearing your version. Willis nodded, as if he'd expected her answer. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his movements deliberate and controlled. Your name was flagged, he said, but not for the reasons you might think. This isn't about you personally, Dr. Bennett. It's about what you know. Rachel's expression didn't change, though a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, passed through her eyes. Why no, she repeated. Interesting. And what is it, exactly, that you think I know? Willis leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. You were part of Project Meridian, he said. Weren't you? The name hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. Rachel didn't flinch, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a tension that hadn't been there before. For the first time since this ordeal began, she seemed genuinely affected. I haven't heard that name in years, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. How do you know about it? Willis didn't answer immediately, his gaze never leaving hers. Let's just say I have access to certain information, he said finally. But what I don't have are the answers we need. That's where you come in. Rachel laughed softly, though there was no humor in the sound. So that's what this is about, she said. You think I'm going to fill in the blanks for you? Willis shrugged. You're the only one who can. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. And what makes you think I will? She asked. Willis smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Because you don't have a choice, he said. Not if you want to protect what's left of Project Meridian. Rachel's expression hardened, her calm exterior cracking just enough to reveal the storm brewing beneath. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice low but firm. Project Meridian was shut down years ago. It's over. Willis shook his head, his smile fading. You and I both know that's not true, he said. The project might have been shut down officially, but its legacy lives on, and if we don't act now, it could destroy everything. Rachel stared at him, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what he was saying. She didn't trust him, she couldn't, but there was something in his tone, something in his words, that struck a chord deep within her. He wasn't lying, at least not entirely. What do you want from me? She asked finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil building inside her. Willis leaned back, his expression softening just enough to seem almost genuine. I want the truth, he said. All of it, before it's too late. Rachel didn't respond, her thoughts spinning as she tried to make sense of the situation. She had spent years running from her past, burying the secrets she had sworn never to reveal. But now, it seemed, those secrets had caught up with her, and for the first time in a long time, Rachel wasn't sure she could outrun them. Rachel stared at Agent Willis, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The mention of Project Meridian had cracked open a part of her life she had spent years trying to seal shut. It wasn't just a name. It was a Pandora's box. And now, here it was, threatening to unravel everything. But what disturbed her more was the certainty in Willis's voice. He wasn't guessing. He knew something, something dangerous. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes locked on his. "If you know so much," she said slowly, "then you must also know why I walked away." Willis's expression softened, though it wasn't sympathy that filled his eyes. It was calculation. "I know what you were a part of," he said. "I know what you built, but I also know why it matters now more than ever." Rachel shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You think you understand," she said. "But you don't. Project Meridian wasn't just a program. It was a line we were never meant to cross. When we did, we paid the price." Willis didn't flinch. "And you think walking away erased that?" he asked. "You think ignoring it makes it disappear?" Rachel's jaw tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Of course she didn't believe that. She had known, even as she left, that the project's consequences would follow her. But she had convinced herself that by staying silent, she could at least contain the damage. "You're playing with fire," she said, her voice low but sharp. "If you're digging into Meridian, you don't understand what you're dealing with." Willis leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "And that's exactly why I need you," he said. "You were there when it started. You know what it can do." Rachel's mind raced, fragments of memories flashing through her mind like broken shards of glass. The late nights in the lab, the endless streams of data, the moment when everything had spiraled out of control. She could still hear the alarms, still see the looks of horror on her colleagues' faces as they realized what they had unleashed. And now, years later, she was sitting in a small airport security office, facing the possibility that it wasn't over. She shook her head again, this time more forcefully. "You don't get it," she said. "Meridian isn't something you can control. It's bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than anyone." Willis didn't respond immediately, his gaze steady as he studied her. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Bigger than you, yes," he said, "but not bigger than the people who are trying to weaponize it." Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had feared this, deep down, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a chill through her. "Weaponize it," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Willis nodded. "That's why you were flagged," he said. "Someone else is trying to pick up where Meridian left off. And they're using your research to do it." The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in around her. Rachel gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "That's not possible," she said. "All the data was destroyed. I made sure of it." "Not all of it," Willis said. "There are fragments. Enough for someone determined, and dangerous, to rebuild it." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The implications were staggering. Meridian wasn't just a project. It was a game changer, a breakthrough so powerful that even a fraction of its potential could shift the balance of power on a global scale. In the wrong hands, it could be catastrophic. "Who?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Who's behind this?" Willis hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We don't know yet," he admitted. "But they're moving fast. And they're not working alone. Whoever it is, they have resources, connections. They've been watching you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Rachel had always been careful, always stayed one step ahead. But the thought of someone tracking her movements, waiting for the right moment to strike, it was almost too much to process. "They think I'll lead them to it," she said, more to herself than to Willis. "That's why they're watching me." Willis nodded. "Exactly. And if they're willing to go this far, you can bet they won't stop until they get what they want." Rachel's mind spun as she tried to process the enormity of the situation. She had spent years trying to bury her past, to distance herself from the project that had defined, and nearly destroyed, her life. But now it seemed that past was clawing its way back, more dangerous than ever. "What do you need me to do?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Willis leaned back, his expression softening just enough to seem almost human. "We need to stop them," he said. "But to do that, we need to understand what they're after. We need you to help us connect the dots." Rachel hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, to disappear again. But she knew it was too late for that. The stakes were too high, and running wouldn't change anything. If Meridian was in play, there was no escaping it. "Fine," she said, her voice firm. I'll help you, but on one condition. Willis raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Rachel leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. We don't just stop them, she said. We destroy Meridian for good. Willis studied her for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. But as Rachel sat back, her resolve hardening, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, in the shadows, someone was pulling the strings, setting a plan in motion that could change everything. And as much as she hated to admit it, Rachel knew she was the only one who could stop it. But at what cost? The uneasy silence between Rachel and Agent Willis was broken by the shrill beep of the phone vibrating on the table. Willis glanced down at the device in front of him, his calm demeanor cracking slightly as he read the incoming message. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked genuinely unsettled. Rachel noticed immediately. What is it? She asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Willis hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to tell her the truth. Finally, he exhaled and slid the phone across the table toward her. You need to see this, he said. Rachel's eyes flicked down to the screen, and her heart skipped a beat. The message was brief but chilling. Asterisk asterisk we have her. Awaiting instructions. Asterisk asterisk beneath the words was a photo, and when Rachel tapped on it, the image filled the screen. Her blood ran cold. It was a grainy but unmistakable picture of her sister, Maya, bound and blindfolded, sitting in what appeared to be a dimly lit warehouse. Rachel's hand trembled as she stared at the screen. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This can't be real. Willis reached across the table, his tone urgent. It's real, he said, and it changes everything. Rachel's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic blur of panic and disbelief. Maya had nothing to do with this. She was a school teacher, someone who had deliberately stayed far away from Rachel's complicated life. The two sisters had always been close, but Rachel had made a point of keeping Maya in the dark about her work, especially after Project Meridian. She had wanted to protect her, to shield her from the fallout. And now, somehow, Maya was caught in the middle. They're using her to get to me, Rachel said, her voice shaking. They think I'll give them what they want if they threaten her. Willis nodded grimly. That's exactly what they're doing, he said. They're trying to force your hand. Rachel's chest tightened as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had spent years running, hiding, trying to escape the shadow of Meridian. But now, everything she had fought to protect was at risk. The stakes weren't just about her anymore. They were about Maya, and possibly countless others if Meridian fell into the wrong hands. What do they want me to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Willis leaned forward, his expression hard. They'll want you to lead them to the core data, he said. The original files, the prototypes, everything they need to rebuild the program. Rachel frowned, shaking her head. The core data doesn't exist anymore, she said. It was destroyed. Are you sure about that? Willis asked, his tone pointed. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but the truth stopped her. She wasn't entirely sure. The destruction of the data had been thorough, or so she had thought. But there had always been whispers, rumors that certain pieces had been copied, stashed away by people who believed Meridian could still be salvaged. Rachel had dismissed those rumors at the time, but now she wasn't so certain. Even if there is something left, she said finally, I wouldn't know where to find it. Willis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim manila folder, sliding it across the table to her. Rachel hesitated before opening it, her stomach sinking as she saw what was inside. It was a series of surveillance photos, all of her. She was in airports, walking down crowded streets, sitting in coffee shops. In every image, she was being watched. They've been tracking you for months, Willis said. They think you're the key, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want, or until someone stops them. Rachel's grip on the folder tightened, her mind racing. She knew what Willis was implying, and the thought made her stomach churn. She had always been a step ahead, always managed to stay out of reach. But now, with Maya's life on the line, she couldn't run anymore. She had to face this head-on. Before she could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Willis's hand went to the gun holstered at his side, his posture tensing as he called out, "Who is it?" A muffled voice came from the other side. "It's Agent Miller. We have a situation." Willis stood, motioning for Rachel to stay seated as he opened the door just enough to speak with the person on the other side. Their voices were low, but Rachel caught fragments of the conversation. Something about an intercepted transmission, an unidentified vehicle, and a possible breach. When Willis turned back to her, his expression was grim. "We need to move," he said. "Now." Rachel stood, her pulse quickening. "What's going on?" "They're here," Willis said. "Whoever sent that message about your sister, they found us." Panic surged through her. "What do you mean, they found us? I thought we were safe here." Willis shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Nowhere is safe," he said. "Not anymore." Before Rachel could respond, the sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the room. Willis drew his weapon, motioning for Rachel to stay close as he moved toward the door. The tension was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity as they waited for whatever was coming. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer. She had no idea who was on the other side of the door, or what they wanted. But one thing was certain, the game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. Rachel pressed her back against the wall, her heart racing as Willis peeked through the crack of the door. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow worse. Willis motioned for her to stay put as he stepped into the hallway, his gun raised. Rachel held her breath, straining to hear anything that might tell her what was happening. The muffled sound of voices reached her ears, quick, tense, and escalating. A shout echoed, followed by the distinct clatter of something metal hitting the floor. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Instead, she grabbed a chair, gripping it tightly as she prepared for the worst. A sudden explosion of noise shattered the tension. The door burst open, and Willis stumbled back into the room, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Behind him, two masked figures in tactical gear stormed in, weapons drawn. Rachel froze, the chair slipping from her hands as they trained their guns on her. "Don't move," one of them barked, their voice distorted by a voice modulator. Rachel raised her hands, her mind racing. She glanced at Willis, who was slumped against the wall, his weapon knocked from his grip. The masked figures moved with precision, one of them grabbing Rachel's arm and yanking her to her feet. "You've caused us a lot of trouble, Dr. Bennett," the other one said, their tone dripping with contempt. "But it ends here." Rachel's pulse thundered in her ears as they dragged her toward the door. She glanced at Willis, who was struggling to stand, and for a moment, their eyes met. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough to tell her he had a plan, or at least he hoped he did. As they moved into the hallway, a sudden commotion erupted from the other end. Shouts echoed, followed by a deafening burst of gunfire. The masked figures hesitated, their grip on Rachel loosening as they turned toward the noise. Seizing the opportunity, Rachel twisted free and ducked behind a corner, her heart pounding as chaos erupted around her. Willis appeared beside her, clutching a second firearm he had retrieved from an ankle holster. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm. Before she could respond, one of the masked figures rounded the corner, their weapon raised. Willis fired without hesitation, the deafening crack of the gunshot ringing in Rachel's ears. The figure dropped to the ground, and Willis pulled Rachel to her feet. "We have to move," he said, his tone urgent. They raced down the hallway, the sound of gunfire and shouting growing louder behind them. Rachel's mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline, but she forced herself to focus. They had to get out, had to survive. Nothing else mattered. As they rounded another corner, they burst into a stairwell, only to find a third masked figure blocking their path. This one wasn't holding a gun. Instead, they held a tablet, its screen glowing ominously. "You think you can stop us," the figure said, their voice cold. "It's already too late." Rachel froze, her eyes locked on the screen. It displayed a countdown, its numbers ticking down rapidly. 15 seconds. 14. 13. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "The final piece," the figure said. Meridian's rebirth. Rachel's blood turned to ice as the realization hit her. The countdown wasn't just for show. It was the activation sequence, something she had never thought she would see again. Her mind raced, trying to remember the fail-safes she had built into the system years ago. If there was still a way to stop it, she had to act fast. Without thinking, she lunged for the tablet, her hands colliding with the figures as they grappled for control. Willis stepped in, shoving the figure back just enough for Rachel to grab the device. The screen flickered as she frantically typed, her fingers flying across the virtual keyboard. The countdown continued. 8 seconds. 7. 6. Come on, she muttered under her breath, her heart pounding. Come on. The masked figure lunged at her again, but Willis intercepted them, tackling them to the ground. Rachel barely noticed, her entire focus on the screen in front of her. She entered the final override command, her breath catching as the countdown froze at 2 seconds. For a moment, everything was still. Then the screen went black, and Rachel let out a shaky breath. It was over. But before she could process what had just happened, a soft chime sounded from the tablet. The screen lit up again, displaying a new message. Asterisk, asterisk, fail-safe activated. Secondary protocol in progress. Asterisk, asterisk. Rachel's stomach dropped as the meaning of the words sank in. The countdown wasn't the end. It was the beginning. What is it? Willis asked, his voice strained as he pinned the masked figure to the ground. Rachel stared at the screen, her mind racing. It's not just Meridian, she said. They've linked it to something else, something bigger. The masked figure laughed, a chilling sound that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. You can't stop it, they said. It's already in motion. Before Rachel could respond, the building shook violently, the lights flickering as a low, ominous hum filled the air. Whatever they had triggered, it was happening now. And for the first time, Rachel wasn't sure if she could stop it.